Good evening all and welcome. Listen, before we continue, seriously, some of these stories are quite graphic, quite messed up, and are definitely not for the faint of heart. If you think this could be you, feel free to pick another video, because this one is definitely not for you. We have mentions of gore, violence, and other stuff that could trigger you. You have been warned. But for now, it is time to get profoundly uncomfortable and let the darkness take control. This is probably the most frightening call I have ever had in 10 years, because of the human element. The call came in as a simple, suspicious person at a large nursing home, with not much more information than that. My partner and I arrive to find a woman waiting outside next to her vehicle. The car was off, and she was carrying a small child who appeared to be around 3 years old. The administrator explained that the woman, Tracy, was a contracted worker for the facility. She was a nurse of sorts, who came in occasionally to help with elderly patients. According to staff, she had shown up on her day off, started talking to an elderly gentleman called Joe, then placed her baby in Joe's lap and tried to wheel him out of the building while he was screaming the whole time. When they stopped her, she just became angry and claimed they were holding her grandfather hostage and that she just wanted to take him for a walk. The problem was that Joe was not related to Tracy at all. He was a retired cop himself. While staff tried to calm her down, Tracy became distracted, attempted to steal medication, and scratched another nurse when they intervened. By all accounts, just a few hours earlier, she had seemed completely normal. She had gone to work without complaint, acted happy, and then gone home. There was no known history of drug use or mental illness. The facility itself was reluctant to press charges because the shift in her behavior was so sudden and extreme. It almost felt like she had been replaced with another woman entirely, who happened to just look like her, but was criminally insane. When I spoke to Tracy, she seemed calm. She explained in a steady and obviously not crazy voice what she was doing and why. She gave us all the information we needed and did not act out or give me any immediate reason to take her into custody. The only thing that set off alarm bells was her insistence that Joe was her grandfather, even though he had already proven he was not. My only real option would have been some kind of emergency mental health hold, but I did not have enough grounds to force it. Her son appeared to be well cared for, so we decided to call family and have them come out. Her father arrived and confirmed that, as far as he knew, Tracy was fine. She had no history of drug use and had never complained of mental health issues or physical problems that would have suggested something was wrong. I even spoke with the magistrate about getting charges secured so she could be treated, since she would not do it on her own, but that was refused immediately. At that point, the only option left was for her father to try and get a custody order against her. He spent a few minutes speaking with her, then pulled me aside and said, "I can tell you that woman looks like my daughter but isn't." And that was the moment everything changed for me. As the conversation was happening, I heard the car door open and then the doors lock. My stomach dropped, though I couldn't have explained why. It was that sixth sense you develop after enough time on the job, the one that tells you something's wrong before your brain catches up. Sometimes someone sets off a warning and you just can't explain. Because inside the car, Tracy was holding her little boy in her arms. I knocked on the window and asked if we could talk a little more. She refused. I asked if her father could hold the baby and she said, "That's not my father." I kept trying talking with my supervisor, who thankfully had seen the whole thing, tried the other door. He took over the conversation while I moved around the car and tried the handles. Both of us were getting the same bad feeling which neither of us could explain. She was not giving us any obvious reason to force the issue, and legally we still had no clear cause. Then Tracy said, "You're just trying to take my baby away." She pulled the child tight against her chest. The baby stopped laughing, then it stopped breathing. The little jerks in its hands and feet told me immediately that something was terribly wrong. I hit the window 3 times with my baton before it finally broke, all the while my supervisor yelled at me to get in there. I crawled through the broken glass and reached across the seat, pulling the baby's head free from her arms. It let out a terrible, bloody cry, and Tracy turned to look at me in the face. I saw the driver's door open, and then Tracy just smiled at me. "You're just trying to take my baby, you devil." Everything after happened too fast to process. Tracy bared her teeth and bit the baby. The sound that came next was pure pain. I lunged forwards, wrapped my arms around her lower jaw and upper forehead and pulled her off the child. Tracy went limp, and the grandfather took the baby inside for treatment. The child would live, but would have the same amount of ears as Van Gogh. I saw Tracy later in court, after all the charges were dropped in favor of a lifetime commitment to a mental institution. The life had gone out of her eyes completely, as if whatever had been in there that day had been left behind. The lights were on, but no one was home. I still cannot explain how an otherwise healthy, vibrant person can go from normal to that level of madness in so little time, and it haunts me more than any ghost story ever could. When I was an emergency medical technician in a small town, a fellow emergency medical technician I worked with had something happen that she wanted to share. She was called out to a freeway accident involving multiple victims, and several of them were unstable. It was her very first call, so she was already extremely nervous before she even got there. When she arrived on scene, everything was chaos. One vehicle was flipped, and there were injured people scattered about. It was early in the morning on a stretch of freeway that doesn't get much traffic at that hour, so aside from the accident, there wasn't much around except their ambulance, a state patrol unit, and the damaged vehicle itself. She was assigned to one of the victims and tried to stabilize him, but her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely do what she needed to do. She said she felt completely overwhelmed, like she might have to step back and let someone else take over because she couldn't get herself under control. While she was in the middle of that, a man suddenly came up to her and said, "I'm a doctor. I will help you." It's not unheard of for bystanders to stop and offer help, but in this case it stood out. There had been almost no traffic, and she hadn't seen anyone arrive, but still she didn't question it. She needed help, and he was calm and direct. Together, they were able to get the patient secured onto a backboard and ready for transport. Once they were finished, the man said, "I'm going to help them," and pointed towards another emergency medical technician who was working with a different victim. She thanked him and watched him walk over and kneel down beside them like he was about to assist. She turned back towards her own patient, who needed an airway device, and started getting things ready. When she turned again to call out to the other emergency medical technician, the man was gone. She assumed he had stepped away or left the scene, which can happen quickly in those situations. Because of how severe the injuries were, and the distance to the nearest hospital, which was about 50 miles away, a medical helicopter had been called in to transport the patients. Once everyone had been loaded and the helicopter had left, things finally started to slow down. Afterwards, she went to the other EMT and said, "Wasn't it great having a doctor help out?" He looked at her confused and asked what she meant. He said there hadn't been anyone else there besides their team and the state patrol officer. But she insisted. There had been a man who helped her, and she had seen him walk over and kneel next to him while he was working on his patient. but the other EMT told her no one had come over to assist him at any point. Still unsure, she went to the state patrol officer who had been directing traffic and asked if he had seen a tall man stop to help them. He told them only a handful of cars had passed by during the entire incident, and that no one had stopped on the scene. She never found out who the man was, or where he came from. I have been a cop since I was 22 years old. I graduated at the top of my class, aced every exam, and had a job offer waiting for me the moment the last sergeant shook my hand at graduation. I accepted it and flew across the country because I wanted to be seen as dependable. Even so, nothing in training could have prepared me for the kind of horror that can come from living in Vermont. If the freezing temperatures or the black bears don't kill you, there's still plenty out there that might. When I first took the job as an assistant trainer at the state police barracks in Newport, I thought I was signing up for Green Mountains and maple syrup, but I was wrong. I originally hail from Anaheim, California, so I was convinced this frigid wasteland would be the death of me. I have always thought of myself as a tough woman. But I know now that I was woefully unprepared for the things that lurk out there. The call that started my nightmare should have been a routine domestic abuse case, but it completely changed how I understood reality. In the 3.5 years I had been there, I had already seen humans and animals frozen to death, lumberjacks crushed by fallen trees, cars totaled after hitting huge moose, and timber rattlesnakes meaner than any diamondback. I thought these were bad enough. So last Saturday, I had no paperwork left to finish, and since I was field trained, I asked my friend, Officer Travis Hayes, if I could ride with him on a domestic abuse call that had just come in. His partner had already gone home for the night, so he agreed to take me along as backup. As we put on our jackets and headed out to the snow-dusted cruiser, I felt a little rush of excitement. I had not been out in the field in months, and I had been itching for some action now that my most recent class had graduated. I looked over the notes and focused on the fact that we needed to speak with a man called Robert Bell, who was the suspected wife-beater. Officer Hayes and I drove for about 15 minutes, eventually ending up in one of those pothole-ridden roads Vermont is famous for. The snow was up to our thighs, and even our tactical SUV had trouble getting up some of the icier hills. We were already cursing our luck for being sent out to a place in the countryside, especially since it was 7 p.m. and completely dark. A concerned neighbor, Miss Margaret Fletcher, had called us, and when we got to her house, she told us there were strange screams coming from the creek area behind the house. We had assumed the fighting was happening inside Robert Bell's house, and Margaret said it had been about 10 minutes since before we arrived. She led us out to her back porch, and as soon as we stepped through the doorway we could hear the screams. They were hard to describe. They sounded like a low, distorted version of a frantic woman yelling, each one lasting between 3 and 10 seconds, and none of them sounded like real words. It was a cry of pure terror. My adrenaline was pumping so hard, I didn't even want to bother knocking on Robert Bell's door. Normally we would have gone next door and questioned the suspect, but when someone is clearly in trouble, we are allowed to prioritize safety over the usual process. So we sprinted off the porch and made our way towards the sound as quickly and carefully as we could. Hayes and I heard 2 more screams, and each one seemed louder the closer we got to the creek. We were both getting unnerved, and as we moved into the woods, we started wondering if it could be an animal. A mountain lion can sound like a distressed woman, and our little flashlights were not doing much to cut through the shadows. By the time we were approaching the creek bed, we had not heard a scream for about 5 minutes. We started calling out, telling whoever was there to come forward or to let us know where they were, but there was nothing. I began checking for footprints and found only ours, along with something that looked vaguely deer-like. The snow was powdered and kicking up a misty sheen around us, but even after a thorough search, we didn't find any blood trail or signs of a struggle. We were just about to head back when the air around us exploded into shouting and screaming and savage howling. We both froze. I could see my confusion reflected in Hayes' face. I opened my mouth to ask whether he was hearing the same thing I was, and then we heard the exact same scream we had heard from the porch. This time it came from directly behind us, but there was nothing there except for an open clearing. Hayes took off into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing to investigate, and then there was another long silence. I did not even hear his footsteps crunching through the snow, and I started to get anxious. About 10 minutes later, he came out from a different direction, and for a split second I thought I saw his eyes shine red in the beam of my flashlight. I told myself the snow and the light must be playing tricks on me, and Hayes waved me over, told me we needed to get out of there, and for a moment he looked almost angry, but then he crossed the clearing towards me. He was moving awkwardly through the snow, stumbling like he had been drinking. I was about to ask what was wrong with him when another strange cry came from our right, and I nearly screamed. That was the last straw. I grabbed Hayes by the arm and all but dragged him back through the snow, holding his bicep tightly so he wouldn't stumble again. I was about 60 pounds lighter than him, but my adrenaline was pumping so hard that I hauled us up the hill like it was nothing. Just as we were halfway back up the hill, the scream came again. It was so loud it felt like it was right beside me, and I swung my flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. In that frozen Vermont forest, there were no animal eyes shining back at us, no bushes rustling or footsteps at all. As I traced our path back towards the house, a desperate wail sliced through the air, and it almost sounded like my name. It lasted about 10 seconds, and it was louder than anything before it. By then I was terrified, but I still had enough sense to stop and tell Margaret to call us if anything else happened. She never called again, and I got out of there as fast as the cruiser could safely go. I still do not know what was in those woods, and as someone who loves the outdoors, I know no animal that makes that kind of sound. What still gives me shivers is how completely silent it was between the screams. It might not sound strange at first, but during Vermont winters there is always some kind of ambient noise in the forest. Even if it's the cries of crows or the wind moving through bare branches, there is always something. That night though, even back near Margaret's house away from the source of the wailing, there was nothing. Whenever I bring it up, Officer Hayes gives me the same cryptic answer. He said I should be glad we got out of there alive, because the danger was closer than I could possibly know. A number of years ago, I worked as a small town cop in a remote northern Australian town. The town was a popular tourist spot, but crime was common, especially break-ins and car theft. It was one of those places where, despite the scenery, you always expect something to happen. It was around 2 a.m. on a fairly quiet shift, and my partner and I were patrolling the outskirts of town. The air was heavy with humidity, and suddenly the radio cracked to life. One of our regular dispatchers came on the air, but this time there was something different about her voice, as she was usually very calm, but there was something rushed and breathless in the way she was speaking now. Even before the details came through, I could tell this would not be a routine call. The message went out to all units, intruder on premises. In our line of work, that shorthand meant this was a priority job. We did not wait around for the full picture. We turned the car towards the address immediately while dispatch filled us in as we drove. A young woman was home alone. She had put the air conditioner on her bedroom, crawled under a thick doona, and texted her cousin for a bit before sleeping. Then she woke up, feeling something was wrong. She opened her eyes and saw a man standing in her room just watching her. What made the whole thing worse was that she didn't panic. Instead of screaming, she acted as if she was still asleep, shifted slightly, curled up deeper under the blankets, and then under the doona reached for the phone she'd left on the bed and texted her cousin about the man standing over her. Her cousin was the one who called us and relayed everything to dispatch. While we were still on the way, the victim kept texting that the man was still there next to the bed. She could hear him breathing and shifting his weight from time to time. And that detail stuck with me because it meant she was laying there in total silence, knowing he was close enough to hear her if she made the wrong move. As we got closer, we talked about whether to turn on the red and blues and in the end decided against it. We were worried that the intruder realized police were outside and might panic and take it out on her before we got in, so we came in as quietly as we could. We arrived just behind another unit, and in the dark I could see the other officers moving around the front of the house while our car rolled in. The headlights caught the man as he fled from the far side of the property. He was barefoot, sprinting across the driveway, but our guys on foot spotted him immediately, and we went after him. He didn't get very far. He was overweight and running barefoot on a road, and at that hour it was never going to end well for him. We caught him fast, and what surprised me the most was how ordinary he looked. A bit scruffy, a bit bogan, a bit unkempt, but otherwise he was just a fairly average bloke. Nothing about him looked monstrous or dramatic or overtly criminal. Later, he admitted that he enjoyed breaking into women's homes so he could watch them sleeping, that it made him feel powerful, invading people's privacy and violating their sense of safety. He would not say what else he had done, but at that point it was obvious that this was not a one-off. That specific night stayed with me because of how close it came to turning into something much worse. The woman did everything right once she realized what was happening, and the fact that she stayed quiet probably saved her life from a far more dangerous outcome. Even now, I still think about how calm that bedroom must have looked from his side, and how terrifying it must have been from hers. The call came in for a vehicle fire, with someone still trapped inside. This wasn't the first time either. It was the third car fire in roughly 4 to 6 months in the same neighborhood. And something didn't sit right about that, but I was still new and just off probation and didn't have the experience to question it. It was the middle of the night and out on a small residential road that ended in a dead end. I got there after the fire crew had already knocked the flames down, and we sat around for what felt like an hour while investigators documented everything. Safe to say, the scene was messy. A 4-door tan sedan had its front tires submerged in a pond on the bank, buried in weeds. The front half of the car was completely destroyed and charred beyond recognition. The B-pillar, the vertical support between the front and rear doors, and the back section were mostly okay, still burnt but nowhere near the level of devastation the front had suffered. When the coroner finally arrived and set up, I was told to put on medical gloves along with 2 other probies, probationary employees like me, and that we were going to remove the body. I took the lead under the guidance of a captain, and after prying and pulling we got the body out of the seat. What I saw was something I'd never expected. The person was face to face with the skull. The cranial muscle and skin tissue was so thin, so broken down, I'd actually opted to wear extrication gloves, heavy-duty gloves meant for vehicle rescues, because I didn't want my glove tearing. But I learned something disturbing that night. After being cooked at extremely high heat, Skin breaks down when you give it even a decent squeeze, and it was gross beyond words. But the creepy part wasn't the body itself, it was the road. This was a dead end, and there were circular skid marks all at the end of it. None of them were long enough to suggest she had been driving fast, realized it was a dead end, locked her brakes, and slid off the road. Instead, all the marks looked like someone had been doing donuts there, spinning the car in circles before she floored it towards the pond from a stop or slow rolling speed. The mud, weeds, and water stopped the car before it went all the way in, which meant she probably didn't die from the crash. She either crashed because the fire started first, or she crashed and it didn't work the way she'd hoped, and decided going up by fire was the move. The seatbelt had been burned off, but she didn't try to get out. She was the only person in the car. There was no evidence of anything medically going wrong before the crash, but that would have been a crazy chain of events. I do not know what the story ended up being. I do know she was tracked by her vehicle identification number and license plate to a nearby town back before it happened. Something wasn't right. I could just feel it. Another notable call was a middle-aged man that fell backward a couple of steps up his stairs from a ground level and busted his head open. Cerebrospinal fluid and everything. Basically, instant death. Relatives and possibly older kids were home at the time, though I don't remember exactly. But what struck me was how no one seemed to care that much. It was like this was a normal Tuesday evening. No one panicked, cried, or seemed remotely surprised. More sad than anything, to be honest. This other call, well, it was more of a series of calls, was the same person repeatedly. Frequent flyers, you might call them. Patients who call emergency services at least once a week for difficulty breathing or chest pain. A tiny old lady living in a condemned building with anywhere from 5 to 8 other people. She was essentially a hypochondriac, or maybe she just liked using us as a way to get out of the house for a bit. She never had anything wrong with her. She was super rude every time. She would say she couldn't breathe, but her oxygen level would be at 99%, or her nasal cannula, the oxygen delivery device, with completely normal results, meaning when I listened to her lungs with a stethoscope, everything sounded fine. Nothing was wrong, yet she would call and complain and act like she was dying. Over time, it became clear she was just using us, but the whole thing left me wondering if she was truly ill, or if there was something else going on that we couldn't see. But those are my notable calls, and they have left an imprint on me that I cannot shake. I was 21 and had just become a police officer, and had also just been dumped. So when my friend suggested Tinder, I figured why not? At 21 and a brand new cop, I had the classic, invincible mindset where I could handle anything. And bear in mind, this was about 8 years ago. I matched with a very attractive woman who was honestly way out of my league. We talked for a while and eventually planned to meet up, and she told me of a great open field where we could look at the stars and hang out, and we would meet at her house first. When the night came, I was excited. She seemed excited too when I picked her up and guided me out to the field. And it really did look peaceful at first. It was an open space with woods nearby, deer, and other wildlife, and I noticed dim headlights in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it, but that's when the van started driving towards us and pulled in front of us, so close that it almost blocked me in. I told her to stay in the car while I talked to the driver. I grabbed my flashlight from the car and walked up to the van. The driver was a fairly large man. I asked him what was going on and told him to back up a little. He was polite and said he owned the property and did not mean to scare us. He told me he had been having trouble with poachers and just wanted to make sure we were not out there to shoot anything. I told him we were only there to look at the stars and watch the wildlife. He said it was fine, wished us a good date, and drove off. After that, the woman started texting non-stop. About an hour later, I saw headlights coming back, this time fast. I got back in my car and moved it into a more defensive position. The same man came in close enough that he almost hit the car. At that point, she got out and ran towards him. Immediately, I knew I was in trouble. I got out and gave them the command to back up and get on the ground. Neither of them listened. The man charged at me and knocked me to the ground, but luckily I was able to get him on his back and get back up. Then I saw my date grab a metal pipe from the van. She told me they had a gun and said that if I gave them my money and truck, I wouldn't get hurt. I was still in my invincible era, so I said no. She started crying and said they didn't want to hurt me. Then the man started moving back towards the car. That's when I told them I was a cop, drew my concealed firearm and ordered both of them to get on the ground. After a moment of shock, they complied. I called 911, gave my name and badge and told dispatch I had 2 people at gunpoint and needed backup immediately. I gave them the best directions I could to the field, but while I was on the phone, both of them took off. So of course I did something stupid again and chased them. I ran after the man who disappeared into the woods around the field and chased him for maybe 30 seconds before I heard 3 loud pops and saw a muzzle flash. That's when my invincible attitude vanished completely. I ran like hell back to my car and got the heck out of there. I went back to where I had picked her up, called dispatch again and had officers sent there. Naturally, the first officer to show up were my sergeant and my field training officer. They were completely understanding and absolutely did not give me any grief at all. The words I heard the most were dumbass and stupid rookie. I got in their car. We went back towards the field. Luckily, the van was still there. I was told to stay quiet and only come out if shots started flying. They cleared the area and searched the van. They found meth right on the center console and searched the rest of the vehicle. What really scared me was when my field training officer and sergeant came back to the patrol car, let me out, and told me to look in the back of the van. Both of them were pale and horrified, because in the back there were several knives, duct tape, lighter fluid, a decent amount of rifle ammunition, handcuffs, and what appeared to be dried blood. In the front passenger seat, we found an AR-15 style rifle and 2 more handguns. We called for immediate backup and detectives. When they checked the blood, it turned out not to be blood at all. The license plate had been stolen, and the van had been reported stolen too. I still get teased about the whole thing, but luckily no one got hurt. I will never use online dating again. Through my mid to late 30s, I worked as a Garda officer in Ireland. Back home, that's what we call the police. I was assigned to a small community on the west coast, isolated from everywhere else. There were no trains, no nearby airports, no taxis, no Uber, and only 1 bus a day, which is probably the only reason the place had its own Garda station. Most other small hamlets would have relied on officers from the nearest town, but this place was so isolated that it needed a station of its own. The hamlet covered a wide stretch of farmland, along with a number of empty and derelict properties. Like many rural areas in Ireland, it had changed a lot over the years. When the country industrialized, a lot of people from places like this moved to the city in search of easier and better paid work, and the result was a place that felt half lived in and half abandoned. Even so, the residents who remained were some of the most grounded, decent people you could ever hope to meet, but all the same, the area had a strange feeling to it that was hard to shake, especially after dark. Our station was small. We had 3 112 dispatchers, though most calls were routed through another center, and around 7 officers in total, but most of them were from out of town. We all knew each other well, and if we got a call from the area, even if it was something minor, Most of us would come in simply because there was so little to do on those long shifts. One night, we receive a call from a landline phone. It had originated from a derelict property on the edge of the hamlet, far from the other plots of land. The call was a hang-up and had lasted no more than 13 seconds according to dispatch. I was asked to go alone, because every officer on that side of the country was tied up responding to a fatal crash on a nearby motorway involving 3 cars and 2 lorries. So I stepped outside into the cold wind, got into my car, and drove towards the property without lights or sirens. As I got closer, the place instantly gave me a bad vibe. It was an old wooden farmhouse with a blackened, battered exterior, and I had the uneasy sense that I was not welcome there. I got out, walked up to the front gate, opened the wet, mouldy latch, and made my way slowly to the front door. I knocked hard and called out that I was the Garda officer and asked whoever was inside to let me in, but received no answer. After waiting about 20 seconds, I knocked again and told them that if they did not answer, I might have to force entry. I asked them to come to the door again, but still received no response. If anything, I almost wished someone would answer, even if only to make me feel less alone. The silence made me feel far more vulnerable. I called dispatch and asked for backup, telling them there might be people inside and that I might need to force the door if no one answered. They told me to keep an eye on the property and said they could send an officer from the nearest town in about 25 minutes. I thanked them, though I was already feeling the tension tight in my chest. I walked back towards my car, but before I reached the gate, I looked up and saw an old man staring at me from an attic window. He looked ill, unshaven, and deeply unsettling. I stared back for a moment in shock, then pulled out my flashlight and shone it up to the window. He immediately ducked down out of sight. I shouted up that he needed to come downstairs and answer the door, and that more Garda officers were on their way. I told him we needed to speak to him, and that this was his chance to do it calmly. At this point, I was becoming genuinely unsettled by how the night was unfolding. I updated dispatch, and they said they would alert the incoming officers to use sirens and make their way here as quickly as possible. Even over the radio, they sounded uneasy. I stayed at the front gate, scanning the windows and waiting, but there was still no movement at the door, only the sick feeling that I was being watched. I could not stop thinking about the man's face. After about 20 minutes of repeated knocking and continued silence, the second car finally arrived, and I briefed the 2 officers who were inside. We approached the front door together. One of them, a very tall and intimidating man, spoke in a deep and forceful voice, telling whoever it was that if they did not answer the door, it would be forced, and once inside, the person would need to stand with hands up while they entered, handcuffed, and taken to the station for questioning or detention. We went back to the car, where he took out what we call the big red key, a heavy metal tool used to force doors open safely without causing unnecessary damage. The 2 officers positioned it at the door, counted 1, 2, 3, and struck the door 4 solid times, and it gave way with a heavy thump. The house was now open. We went in with flashlights in one hand and tasers in the other, and broken glass crunched under our boots as we stepped into the living room. One of the other officers shouted out that Garda officers had entered the property, and that the occupant should reveal himself with his hands in the air. He warned that we were armed with tasers and authorized to use them if necessary. We moved slowly through the rooms, sweeping our lights into the corners. It seemed empty. We aimed our torches towards the crooked staircase, but before we could even begin to move up, a man suddenly launched himself from the upper floor and onto the stairs. He did not descend normally, he practically jumped at us. He looked deranged, with large red eyes that seemed fixed on me. I shouted at him to put his hands above his head, but before I could finish, he charged down the stairs yelling. One of the officers shouted to taser, and the man let out a horrible scream as the shock hit him. He collapsed to the floor, and we rushed forwards to cuff him. Once we had him secured, he kept rambling about some supposed big man who gave him food every day. We put him in the back of the car, and the other officers followed behind as we drove to the station. During the ride, I gave him the usual warning and read him his rights, but before I could finish, he kept asking me to tell his ex-wife to get out of the car because she was being rude. I told him no one else was in the car, but he would not stop insisting otherwise. At the station, we took him to the front desk and asked his name. He simply replied, "The man you all want to know." In the end, we recorded him as unknown until details were confirmed. The next day, we were told he was to be picked up by the Irish intelligence services. Once my colleagues had finally gotten his name out of him, it turned out he was wanted for stalking a minor, had multiple child abuse charges, and a charge of possession of CP. Learning what he had been involved in made the whole thing feel far worse. After the service arrived to collect him, he told everyone in the station that he would find a way to get us and do what God had told him to do. I'm part of the security team at a hospital that houses a level 1 trauma center. After a while, you get used to things that most people never do, like blood on the floor, families screaming in the hallway, and the steady tone of a monitor that stopped trying. You build a sort of mental wall to kind of block this stuff out in order to get through your everyday. But there is one patient I don't think I'll ever be able to keep out of that wall. It's quite a story. Let me tell you. He was brought in by EMS just after midnight. Dispatch suspected K2 or PCP overdose. The paramedics themselves looked shaken, which is obviously never a good sign. They had him strapped to the gurney, wrists and ankles secured, and the chest was heaving like he'd just run a marathon. He looked like an ordinary guy, in his late 20s wearing gym shorts, a t-shirt, no track marks or obvious signs of long-term drug abuse. If I'd have passed him on the street earlier that day, I wouldn't have given him a second look. The moment they rolled him into the trauma bay, though, all hell broke loose like someone flipped a switch. He started screaming, raw animal noises, deep and guttural, like he was trying to tear something out of his own throat. 4 of us moved in to hold him down while the nurses tried to get lines placed. He was impossibly strong. Not adrenaline strong, desperately strong. Within minutes, he snapped one of the hospital restraints. Now, I've seen people fighting restraints before. They thrash and twist and will end up bruising themselves. But this was different. He pulled until the thick fabric tore at the seams. His wrists were already bleeding, but he didn't even seem to feel it. At one point, he twisted his arm up towards his face and began biting his own fingers in an attempt to eat them. I had both hands on his forearm, using my body weight to keep him from getting leverage, and I could feel his jaw clamping down. The sound of teeth grinding against bone is something I will never forget. The nurses were yelling for more sedation, and the doctors kept calling out doses. They probably pushed enough sedatives into him over those 3 hours to put down a horse. At least 10 times what would knock out an ordinary adult. Each time he'd go slack for maybe 30 seconds, just long enough for us to think it was over, when his eyes would snap open again. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking through us like we weren't even there. At one point, he started whispering fast and frantic, like he was arguing with someone no one else could see, and his pupils were blown so wide there was barely any colour left in them. We cycled staff in and out because no one could hold that level of tension for long. My arms were shaking by the end of it, sweat soaked through my uniform, and I remember thinking, this is what people mean when they say someone is possessed. Eventually, after hours of chemical roulette, he finally went limp, and they transferred him to ICU. I went home that morning exhausted, and 2 days later I was making the rounds when I saw him sitting upright in a regular room, flipping through the TV channels, using the very fingers we managed to save him from biting off. He was completely calm. He looked up when I stepped in, and there was recognition in his eyes and a little bit of embarrassment. He apologized. He said he didn't remember much. He told the doctor he hadn't touched any street drugs, and toxicology backed him up. The only things in his system were Seroquel and Ambien, both prescribed and taken exactly as directed, and he had taken them just before bed. I've dealt with actual junkies and full psychosis. I've seen people tweaking, detoxing, and hallucinating their way through withdrawal. If you show me footage of those 3 hours and ask me to guess, I would have sworn he was high out of his mind on something synthetic and dangerous. But he wasn't. I don't really understand what happened. I have a wonderful tale of creepiness to share, and I honestly never expected it to happen to me. I have always been a grumpy tomboy, and never imagined I would end up with a would-be stalker, especially not in the career I chose. I worked as a forensic death investigator, which meant I handled suspicious death cases for the district attorney office and the medical examiner's office. That usually meant homicides, suicides, accident, and the like. Every now and then I would run into people who had a passing interest in what I did, because they had watched a few episodes of a crime show and thought it made them experts. Annoying for sure, but it was usually harmless. That was not what happened here. It started at a homicide scene I had been called into in the middle of the night. That was where I first met Mr. Fanboy. He was somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, of average height, moderately fit, and he was standing there chattering away with one of the uniformed police officers guarding the scene. That alone was not unusual. I get it, people get curious, people rubberneck, it does happen. But that's when he pulled out a camera and began taking pictures. At that point I figured he was some nosy, tone-deaf journalist, so I gave him a polite lecture about how inappropriate it was to be taking photos at a crime scene, especially when we were preparing to move the deceased. I deleted the pictures and sent him on his way, and assumed I would never see him again. But I was wrong. A week later, he showed up at another questionable scene. It still didn't fully register that something was off. Then a week after that, he appeared at another scene, this one in an entirely different county. That's when I really started to pay attention. I worked in a major Texas city through the medical examiner's office, which meant we handled cases across several surrounding counties, covering a few thousand square miles. Even so, it was odd that this guy kept showing up at the scene all over that area. It was even weirder, because he seemed to be there before anyone else expected him to. I mentioned it to some co-workers, and they told me they had noticed him hanging around their scenes too. The next time he showed up, one of the uniformed officers and I decided to question him directly. We wanted to know who the hell he was and why he had such a hard-on for crime scenes. As I said before, I am used to rubberneckers. People are curious and sometimes they get morbid when something bad happens nearby. Usually once the excitement wears off though, they leave. Mr. Fanboy though was different. He didn't have a criminal record, not even a speeding ticket or parking ticket, so my supervisor decided to talk to him. He was basically told that he was making everyone nervous and that it looked incredibly shady to keep hanging around death scenes. And for a little while he vanished. Then he would switch tactics. If he could not hang around the scene, he would hang around the investigators instead. But of course, only the female ones. That was when he showed up at one of my favorite dive bars, the one I went to because it was near my home, more than 30 miles from where I worked. I'm 5'7" and do not look intimidating in the least. My co-workers used to joke that I looked like a kid playing dress-up in my uniform. Like most women, I tried to be polite with him at first. He was at least 20 years older than me, and I declined every drink he offered. He decided to not take the hint. Instead, he started asking some of the creepiest questions I have ever heard in my life. What was the worst crime scene I had ever investigated? Had I ever worked a case where the victim had been dismembered? Did I think rape and murder cases were really about power dynamics and not sexual motivation? As you can imagine, people, I was completely creeped out. Those were not casual conversation topics. Those were the kind of things I didn't even want to discuss with my therapist, much less some guy giving off serious rapey murderous vibes. At that point, I shut him down completely. I was no longer trying to be polite, and he seemed a little put off, but not exactly apologetic. I went home, put my service weapon back on, and called my supervisor to start building a paper trail in case we needed a restraining order. A few days later, he was served with a cease and desist. Less than 24 hours after that, he was back again and shadowing crime scenes like nothing had happened. At another female investigator scene, he got into an altercation with one of the uniformed officers and ended up being arrested for trespassing, obstruction, and a few other charges. But because he had no record, he was released on bail. And 3 days later, he showed up at the scene I was working at. That's when things got physical. He got into a scuffle after breaking one of my guy's noses to try and get on the scene. He was not as strong as he looked, but I still ended up with a black eye. He looked worse by the time my partner and I finally cuffed him. After that, an investigation was opened. They found a police scanner in his car, along with a lot of creepy journals and notes about where I lived and worked, plus information on one of the other female investigators. From what I heard through the grapevine, his mother's house where he had been living was creepy as hell too. I never thought anyone would get so obsessed with crime scenes and forensic work that it would land them in prison. But here we are. I am also very aware that he had some very unsavory plans for me, or for one of my co-workers, which still makes my skin crawl to this day. To the creepy forensics fanboy, who was probably some Dexter wannabe with way too much CSI and bones in your head, if you get out of prison, let's not meet again. I work EMS for a larger town in the Connecticut Valley. We pretty often get called out to offer mutual aid for smaller towns in the vicinity. We received one such call recently, where something kind of strange occurred to me in my ambulance. The call was in a town whose main route follows a long, winding semi-rural road on the CT Antiques Trail. It was a harsh, wintry New England night, and we were called to the scene of a car accident. A car had gone off the road in the freezing rain and fog, about 20 feet into the woods. Thankfully, when we got there, the patient was relatively okay, with just a few cuts on his hands from the trees breaking through the windshield. His car, however, was a lost cause. It had looked bad when we approached, and honestly, he was lucky to have got out there relatively unharmed. We'd had fatalities on these roads before. In fact, there had been one 2 weeks prior. We transported the patient for evaluation, myself in the driver's seat and my partner in the back with the patient. I was driving slowly and carefully, the low, lying fog coming in waves, some parts denser than others. I watched the world trundle by, old colonial white churches, the occasional warmly lit windows of antique stores, and the swinging signs of quaint businesses glittered with ice. I glanced over to my right, and my eyes caught sight of an old building with a curved drive and a lit-up entryway. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I felt a cold and violently sickening sensation. It felt like a sucker punch to the gut, followed by a frigid gnawing in my gut. It felt like anxiety, an instinctual anxiety that told me to look away, to drive and not turn back. It triggered my entire fight or flight mechanism in under 2 seconds. I have no idea where this sudden feeling came from. I'm not sensitive really, and I've never had anything happen like it before. As I was trying to rationalize the weird twisting in my gut, the lights of the ambulance dimmed and flickered, sending the road ahead of me and the ambulance passenger compartment into total darkness for a moment. I glanced at the camera panel on the dashboard to see if my partner or the patient had reacted to the sudden loss of lights. As I did, I noticed a split second of something pass over the entire left side of the screen. It was black and gauzy, not like a solid shape or a figure of any kind. The patient camera panel faces inward towards the stretcher from the interior of the rear doors. There is nothing near that camera. The doors are regularly opened with no cobwebs or bugs or bags or straps. No smoke or anything within the ambulance could be near the camera. It was all I could do to remain focused as my words caught in my throat. I managed to shout back and check if they were okay. My partner called back that they were all good. It might have been my imagination, but he sounded sort of tense to me. I took my eyes from the camera panel and watched in my peripheral vision as that building, which had caused this feeling, was swallowed by the darkness in my side mirror, and the air felt cold despite the heat being cranked. The radio startled me by crackling slightly, the static drowning out my partner and the patient's conversation. Within that short burst of static, there was a sigh that truly horrified me. I know that sounds silly, but it did. It felt too close, as though it was separated entirely from any of the usual radio traffic, like it lived in between. I couldn't get out of town fast enough. Nothing ever happened again like that. I'm sure there are rational explanations, but I didn't even tell my partner because I felt so stupid. He chalked the light glitch up to a battery fault, and I'm not usually bothered by that stuff, but I later found out, as cliché as it could possibly be, the building was a funeral home. It's so unbelievably stereotypical that it should have just made me cringe, but instead it somehow solidified the idea that it was something I did not want to believe in. I can't help but wonder if it was the spirit of someone who hadn't been as lucky warning me and our patient to be careful on the roads. All the same, it left a mark on me, and I get creeped out every time I have to drive by there. My dad was in the police force. One night, he was driving along a country road when he noticed a motorcycle parked at the side and a man standing beside it. It was late, the road was isolated, and the night was pitch black, with the moon barely illuminating the night sky. It was honestly not the sort of place you wanted to be stranded at. So my dad did the decent thing. He pulled over and wanted to check if he was all right. He stopped the car and heard the skid of the gravel on the side of the road, opened his door, and stepped out to speak with the man. The biker said his motorcycle had cut out and would not restart. My dad had a brief chat with him, and then he turned and went back to the police van for a moment. It was only a short absence, maybe 15 seconds or so. But when he returned, no one was there. My dad obviously looked around, expecting to hear an engine or footsteps or maybe a voice further down the road, but there was nothing. He called out a few times in case the biker had moved somewhere out of sight, but it very quickly became apparent that there was nowhere for him to have gone to. This was a narrow country road with open ground around it, and there was no plausible way for a man and a heavy bike to vanish in such a short space of time. What unsettled my dad the most was he had physically touched both the man and the bike. He had spoken to him face to face and handled the situation as a real breakdown, and then suddenly he was gone. He said he freaked the hell out, got back in the van quickly, and regardless of whatever plausible explanation there might have been, he didn't want to stay there and try and look for one. A few days later, he mentioned it to a colleague, and that is when the story grows ever stranger. It turns out a biker had been killed in that exact spot in a traffic accident a few years earlier, and my dad was not the first person to report something like this happening there. That did not make it easier for him to talk about, but it did ease his mind a little, knowing he wasn't the only person who had experienced that event. I wonder about the phantom biker, if he's still around. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed tonight's curated selection of scary stories. And if of course you did, you can let me know by showing me some love down below. It does really mean a lot and go an awfully long way. So thank you all so much for your support. I will be back on Thursday with some babysitter scary stories. They are really good, so I'm hoping to see you there. Not to mention that I would like to give an extra special thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. For those amazing people, there will be some cult stories for you dropping tomorrow. They are very good as well. I hope you enjoy. And if you would like to join this club of amazing supporters, follow the links down below to find out more and get some awesome perks. But that is it from me. Until next time, guys, stay awesome and good night.